Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at civilian harms in conflict. If armed forces cause unintended harm to civilians in the course of action, how should they respond? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science, University College London. Armed conflict is all too common around the world today. One of the consequences of conflict is that civilians are harmed. Military forces, if they respect basic moral and legal standards, seek to avoid those harms so far as they can, but sometimes they will fail in that. So how should armed forces and governments respond when they cause unintended harms to civilians? Well, that's a question that the United States and its allies are thinking about very carefully at the moment. One of the researchers whose work is shaping that process is Dr. Kaylee Hurd. Kaylee has advised multiple governments and NGOs around the world. She's also lecturer in human rights here in the UCL Department of Political Science, and I'm delighted that she joins me now. Welcome, Kaylee, to UCL Uncovering Politics. Your first appearance, I think, on the podcast. It's great to have you. And let's start with some context for the discussion that we're going to have here. So when we're talking about harms caused to civilians by the United States, by its allies, what are we talking about here? What are the contexts in which this takes place, and what are the harms that are involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about civilian harm in armed conflict, we're talking about harm that's caused to civilians by coalition forces in their overseas operations. And this can happen in several kind of different categories of ways. We can talk about the most obvious type of harm that we might think about, which we might call direct harm. This is kind of the harms you think about when you think about this topic. So direct physical harm to people's bodies, including deaths or injuries. It can also include property damage to people's homes, infrastructure, those types of things. We can also talk about indirect harm, which might entail things that are not physical harms, but influence the quality of life or people's access to basic necessities of life. So you could think about damage done to medical services and people's ability to access a doctor or emergency services, damage to water treatment facilities, and those types of things that are going to impact whether people have access to clean water and those types of things. And then we can also talk about a newer concept called reverberating harm. And this would entail the kind of knock-on effects, or what we might call third-order effects of a civilian harm incident that are not directly caused by the incident itself, but can be attributed to it, such as migration patterns out of the affected area, impacts on food supplies or logistics systems, those types of things. So these are kind of the three categories that we think about when we're talking about civilian harm in this respect.
And the context for the conversation that we're having today is that a lot of work is being done in governments, particularly the United States, as I understand it, in thinking about how they should respond when they do cause harm in these contexts. What's prompted them to think about this at the current time?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So civilian harm response, it has quite a long history, you could say. The US in particular started doing it all the way back in the Korean War to kind of account for some of the harms that were caused in that context to civilians. But then it was kind of forgotten about as a mechanism for quite a period of time until the US and its allies were doing operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And they were attempting to kind of deal with the strategic consequences that were popping up when they harmed civilians unintentionally, but there's not a formal legal mechanism for dealing with that because the harm itself is legal under international humanitarian law. And so they started doing kind of different bits of response in different ways, including what we might call condolence or ex gratia payments, which are kind of nominal payments given to civilians to express condolences when a harm has been caused. But generally speaking, over the kind of course of the operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was recognized over time that really these payments and the ways that we were doing them weren't particularly effective. weren't meeting the needs of civilians or their expectations as to how they would be given to them. And so there were a lot of kind of issues that were cropping up over time. But it really wasn't until the kind of fall of the Afghan government in 2021 that we saw policy movement in this regard. So there was one final US airstrike in Afghanistan before the fall of the Afghan government and the final withdrawal that caused a number of civilian casualties in a quite difficult way for the US government to contend with. And because the world was watching, there were some pretty severe reputational consequences. And this led to the first kind of major policy advancement in this space, where we had Secretary Lloyd Austin announce that there was going to be policy reform on how the US approached civilian harm mitigation and response, and outline some really concrete steps as to how that was going to happen. And so in the period since September 2021, we've seen a huge amount of progress in that regard, which is quite unprecedented. The US Department of Defense has released the Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan in 2022. And then just a few months ago, in December 2023, they released the associated Department of Defense Instruction 3017 on this as well. So really operationalizing what DoD needs to do to align with this action plan. So lots of progress in just a short bit of time on this issue, which is quite positive to see.
And just to make sure we're clear on the lingo here, so you talked there about civilian harm mitigation and response. So if I understand correctly, mitigation is referring to trying to limit the harms that are caused, and then response is if harms are caused, how do you then respond to them?
Yes, exactly. So if we're thinking about this you can almost think about it as a before and after. So before a airstrike or something is carried out, the mitigation phase covers that proactive aspect of civilian harm mitigation. So it entails a host of actions that are required to occur to balance what we call military necessity with humanity, basically, and what we would expect in terms of the protection of civilians. And so there's a whole kind of process involved of understanding who is in a space, how you're going to limit the damage and limit the effect to only perhaps the military objective that is being pursued with an airstrike or a ground operation or something like that. The reality of the situation, though, is it's very unlikely in armed conflict we're ever going to get to a point where there isn't a single civilian casualty, right? And so the response process is in recognition of that, basically, that there are still going to be circumstances where a civilian is harmed, and we need to think about how we're going to approach that harm, what is appropriate in terms of how the military responds to that in terms of both tangible and intangible action and assistance in the aftermath of.
And what would you say is motivating the government to pick this up at this time? I mean, is it just a kind of matter of experienced bad PR in response to this particular incident and they don't want that to be repeated? Or is there something deeper going on here?
I think it's a number of things. I think fundamentally it's also something the military and the US military has recognized that it is the right thing to be doing. And that's a conversation we've been having for quite some time. But there's also a strategic element to doing civilian harm response. Notably, in the aftermath of a civilian harm incident, there's a lot of consequences that are likely to result if that situation is not managed well, right? So you can think of that community's support levels for either side of the conflict changing tacitly or tangibly, right? The military in situations of counterinsurgency operations, right, might be reliant on them for critical information flows, or there might be increased risks for what we call force protection, so like the safety of our own forces from increased attacks. There might be risks for retaliation, revenge. There might be risks for members of that community to be radicalized, right? So all of these things are aspects that feed into why the military is kind of looking at civilian harm response, not just as, the right thing to do, but strategically valuable to their own operations and operational success.
Okay, great. So that's what governments are doing, particularly the US government. Let's move on to you then. How have you got involved in these debates?
Yeah, so that started out in a very, very unexpected way, I would say. Back during the early days of my PhD, I was in a seminar on international norms with Dr. Richard Price, my former PhD supervisor, and we were talking about art restitution in conflict.
Art restitution?
Yes, so the provision of, or the return of art, or the provision of funds if that art can't be returned to families from which it's been stolen during conflict. And we were talking about the concept of that and what restitution looks like in conflict, and kind of had a light bulb moment of, well, what would this look like if we were to think about this in the context of how do you think about that concept in relation to human life? And can you think about that in relation to human life? And so that really is where I got started off. And I've been in various different ways working on this issue ever since, somewhat from a broader perspective of protection of civilians more generally, but more specifically on response within my research. And that's kind of led me to a whole bunch of different places and positions around the world in different capacities,
which we will get into. So your research focuses particularly on the question of how to achieve effective response to civilian harm. What does effective mean in this context?
It's a really good question. So what prompted this was really kind of a gap in what is publicly available about civilian harm response, in that, we know it was happening for quite a few years, but there was a lot of talk from governments and departments of defense of, this is a great thing we're doing, but there is no kind of public literature or inquiry on whether it worked or not, and what working would mean for anybody involved. And so, that probably seems like a very basic question, but it was unanswered. And so that's what I kind of started working on, was what would it mean for it to work, and who gets to decide what that means? And so my work really focused on the context of counterinsurgency. And in that context, of course, the kind of main fight is over who's perceived as legitimate in the eyes of the population between the insurgents and the counterinsurgents. And so in that context, who gets to decide what's effective? Well, it's civilians, because they are the ones who are determining whether you're perceived to be legitimate or not. And so I spent a fair bit of time kind of working away on this question of what makes civilian harm response effective in the eyes of somebody who's just lost a family member, or a child, or a community member in various different kind of contexts. And so it's kind of a very interesting kind of push and pull between what would be perceived by militaries as, effective in their domain, and what would be civilian priorities in that regard.
And before we get into what you found in relation to that, I think listeners will be fascinated to hear about the process of the research, which involved you going to Afghanistan and Iraq, interviewing people who had been involved, interviewing civilians who had been exposed to harm, and also interviewing military personnel as well. You want to just take us through that process in a bit more detail?
Sure. So to do this research, because it was so civilian-centric in the theory that sits behind it, it was almost essential that I heard from people directly. And so what this all entailed, because so much of the records on civilian harm incidents aren't actually public, is doing a lot of what looked like investigative journalism initially, and relying on some amazing investigative journalists who have worked on this and what they've found, to basically find out where people are and who was affected in what incidents, and really kind of there's a heck of a lot of work involved in just tracking people down. And then once I had, those interviews and those focus groups that I did do with civilians who had experienced harm events were very carefully approached, I suppose you could say. We're talking to people about the worst thing in their life that's ever happened. And many of them have had to fight for even recognition that that's happened to them in the process of, response. And so a lot of those conversations were very difficult ones. I very much see it as a unique privilege that these people who definitely didn't have to were willing to share their experiences with me. But what our conversations really focused on was less the incident itself and more what happened after that. Were they able to report the incident? Was it investigated to their satisfaction? Did they hear from whichever military was responsible in terms of what happened and why? At some point, did they receive some kind of compensation, amends, apology, or anything like that? And what was their level of satisfaction with each kind of stage of that? Did it kind of meet their expectations? And I say, did it meet their expectations in terms of, did it meet their expectations of what they would want to see from a legitimate actor in this circumstance? Rather than, did the whole thing meet their expectations is probably a moot point because they're in pain and unhappy with what's occurred, right? So it's a very delicate kind of set of conversations, but it helped us to kind of have conversations about what was important to them at each of these stages and why that was.
Many of the people listening to this podcast are people who do research or thinking about the ethics of research. And what were the sort of specific ethical concerns that you had to address before you were able to do this research? And how were you able to mitigate those concerns?
So this was definitely an ethically complex project. It took about a year to get ethical approval, so not without its issues as we were kind of in planning. But the kind of considerations that I had to kind of navigate in this regard included both physical and psychological safety for myself as the researcher and several partners that I was working with, as well as the physical and psychological safety of the people that I was interviewing. And so for myself, these were high-risk environments for many, many reasons. At that time, traversed a range of years that went from quite significant conflict and unrest in those areas through to the period of time when COVID was happening as well, and how to kind of navigate doing interview-based research in COVID. And simultaneously, we're talking about really, really difficult, psychologically demanding and hard issues, both for the people who have experienced them and for me as a secondary kind of receiver of that information. And so there are a lot of kind of complex things to consider in that regard of, what protocols to put in place, what kind of questions I was asking and how, what kind of resources did I need to have in my back pocket if it appeared that an interviewee might be kind of struggling psychologically with the conversation. And when I was, having conversations with military personnel, needing to be very cognizant of impacts on their careers and also their psychological well-being, where they're talking about incidents they were involved in. So it's a very complex ethical process, but it was very much worthwhile. It made the research much more careful, but much better informed as well, where those conversations were able to happen quite robustly in what was quite a safe environment.
Well, having had the chance to read some of what you've produced, it is remarkable material. and well worth our listeners looking into. Let's move on to the findings. What do you conclude about effectiveness in harm response?
Mm-hmm. So, a number of things, I guess you could say. So in my dissertation, I looked at 9 cases of civilian harm in depth and the responses to them, ranging completely the way through from the process of reporting that harm through to what we would call compensation or amends. And in 8 of those 9 cases, they were either ineffective or only partially effective. So the track record hasn't been great if we are to take, just these 9 cases that I was able to look at in depth, as there's a lot of lessons out of that in terms of what civilians see as valuable in the response process. Notably, things like timeliness of response is a measure of effectiveness both for civilians and for militaries to get the actual strategic gain out of whatever they're doing. Clear, open communication during the investigation process and sharing what the findings of that are was something that was hugely important to civilians. As I'm sure we can all kind of think about as human beings, it's very difficult to move on from something tragic if we don't know what happened or why. And so that was a really big priority in that investigation process. Safeguarding during this process was a really unexpected finding. Notably, a number of the civilians that I interviewed flagged that it was either pretty unsafe to physically go report an incident, either because they'd have to traverse areas that are physically unsafe, or the perception of showing up at a military base to other actors in the area would put them at further risk. And also through the kind of investigation process, same kind of concerns if they are seen to be collaborating in some way. There are significant perception concerns. And from a compensation and amends standpoint, kind of a number of different things that, those compensation and amends processes are done in a culturally appropriate and respectful way, that the level of payment is appropriate. We've seen a massive, massive range in the kind of level of payments in particular, everything from $126 for in response to the death of a child, all the way through to the last kind of large compensation payment that we know of being closer to €1 million. So a huge, huge range across different militaries and organizations without any kind of consistency. So lots of kind of interesting findings in that regard, but also some kind of wider findings in terms of the ways in which this is militarily strategic to do if done well. So yes, it certainly has, when done well, great implications for force protection, for making sure military troops in a particular area are safe. It also has implications for those critical information flows that I mentioned already, where, those are very, very dependent on robust civil-military cooperation and interaction and those types of things. So lots of kind of different implications in different ways that came out of the findings.
And to what extent were these findings surprising for militaries, or at least raising points that maybe they just hadn't thought of? If they did think about them, maybe they wouldn't be surprising, but it just hadn't occurred to them. You mentioned the safeguarding point there as being one that was surprising. Was that a kind of general thing, that there were elements here that hadn't previously been adequately thought through?
I think you could say yes, almost certainly there's issues across all of these findings that perhaps haven't been thought through. And to kind of the military's defense, they are also doing this in real time with, other pressures, right? Their kind of main thrust in a military operation is military objectives. And so to some extent, it's understandable that this isn't the main priority. But yeah, there's certainly key elements in here that were surprising to me, if not kind of other colleagues on the military side. I think, the extent to which civilians that I interviewed indicated that they would have liked people closer to the incident who might have been involved in the incident or had some kind of decision-making power over the incident to be involved in the response was probably a surprising aspect. The other element that I think was particularly interesting to think about from a military perspective is that civilians do really see that investigation process as part of the response process, almost as of equal value to that compensation and amends issue, where they are, really seeking clarity on what's happened and why, so that they can psychologically move forward with their lives, not move on, but move forward knowing what happened. And that's something that, investigations have always been part of the work that the US military and others do, and it just hasn't necessarily been conceptualized as a response process. It's, something else. So
would it be too much of a caricature to say that militaries often are just kind of imagining that we need to pay some people some compensatory money and that will address the harm, but actually they're much more intangible issues that really matter to people as well, that perhaps the outsider doesn't see?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So in the cases that we have seen go really well in this regard, where both civilians and military personnel involved have said, yeah, that was reasonably effective for what the range of effectiveness can be. It has been really dependent on intangible things. So notably, one of the cases that I looked at that was successful in this regard really reflects the kind of buy-in of one individual into doing this really well. And that was the commanding officer of the particular unit that was involved in the incident. And it seems that they really took it on themselves to approach this in a particularly considered way, where they kind of managed the investigation process or oversaw it themselves. They also brought kind of religious or spiritual support personnel to the scene. They provided medical care where that was possible, but also really pushed on the investigation happening quickly and accurately, and there being an appropriate level of amends provided. So all of these kind of intangible aspects ended up being the way more influential things than just the amount of money that was provided. I'm also kind of aware of other cases, anecdotally, that, the commanding officer of a unit involved has gone to the funerals of those harmed, and that, depending on the context, if that's safe to do, has been quite influential in that community's perceptions of legitimacy. And I think, quite importantly in those cases, right, is the civilian communities that have been affected, they are broken up by these incidents, right? They are so upset and so hurt by what's happened and grieving, but they are also intelligent and understand that sometimes mistakes happen, right? They can fully grasp that this might not have been intentional and something went wrong. And doing some of these intangible things is really helpful in demonstrating that, actually this, we empathize, we can understand the grief and pain, and we want to find a way to be supportive in that where we can.
Let's finally close the loop of our conversation. You've been doing all of this work. The US government is also working on this at the moment. Have you been able to shape their thinking? Has your research been able to make a contribution to the work today?
Yeah, so what I would kind of love to highlight is the US government is really leading the charge on actually doing something about all of these things, which is really fabulous to see for many of us that have been working away on these issues for quite a long time. And so, as I mentioned kind of earlier on, there's, the Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan and the Department of Defense Instruction 3017 that are really kind of key pieces in understanding the US's direction on where they're going to go on these issues. I've been very privileged to be able to support some of that early policy development that is happening for civilian harm response in various different ways, including, some extensions on my research and working with some of their teams that are in charge of kind of doing the work, the real tangible work on this policy development. So yeah, certainly I think, and one of the wonderful things is really it's not just, me they're speaking with on these issues. They are consulting with NGOs who have worked on this for years and years and years. They're consulting with international organizations like NATO and the UN that have, pieces of this puzzle as well in terms of what that looks like in their operation. So in a lot of ways, it's quite commendable the wide net they're casting in terms of trying to gather what expertise exists in this space and harnessing that to improve the direction of where they're going.
Well, thank you so much, Kaylee. It's a deeply impressive piece of work that you've been doing on this, and it's fantastic to see that it's having some influence in the corridors. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
The work that we've been discussing draws on Kaylee's doctoral dissertation completed at the University of British Columbia in 2023. It's called The Price of a Life, The Confluence of Strategy and Legitimacy in Civilian Harm Compensation by Kaylee S. Hurd. It's available online now. We'll put a link in the show notes for this episode, and it will also be published later this year in book form by Palgrave Macmillan. Next week, we're looking at the philosophy of healthcare. Remember to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics. All you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Reddick. This episode was produced by Alice Hart and Eleanor Kingwell-Benham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.